some of you may know our presenter. That being said, I'd like to now introduce you to her. Dr. Megan Kruse, our presenter, is a breast medical oncologist at the Tausig Cancer Institute of Cleveland Clinic. We are also fortunate that she is an LBCA Scientific Advisory Board member. Dr. Kruse received her medical degree from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and completed her residency in internal medicine at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. She then completed a hematology and medical oncology fellowship at Cleveland Clinic, where she served as chief fellow and was appointed as associate staff in 2017. Her main area of clinical investigation is optimization of care for patients with lobular breast cancer, with a special focus on the role of the immune microenvironment. Dr. Kruse is a member of the National Cancer Institute Breast Immuno-Oncology Task Force. She also has an interest in medical education and serves as the Associate Program Director of the Hematology Oncology Fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic. And without further ado and further muting, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kruse.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here with you today. I'm going to take a second to share my slides. And I think this is such a cool, oh, sorry, we were at the end. Let me get back to the beginning. This is such a cool opportunity to be able to talk in this kind of format about the things that advocates care about. And we take for granted so much of what we do is innate to everyone. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit today is we'll discuss a little bit of the research that I presented at San Antonio 2021. And to get there, talk about how research ideas come to be. And then when you're at one of these research conferences, how do you evaluate the data that's there and how do you get the most out of those conferences? And I'll spend a little bit about what goes into research and how advocates can play a role, but I know you have another chat session with that about that topic later this month, so I won't dwell too much on it. But when I think about what goes into a research idea, what I've learned over time in trying to do clinical research is that an important question, one that really matters to clinicians and to patients and to researchers, is the starting point. Because if you don't have good buy-in from those people who are donating their time, their bodies, their radiology images, and their funding, their support, then you really won't go very far. And because these studies do take a lot of investment from many people and much resource, you want to make sure that you get good quality information out of them. So an important question and then a clear goal. And usually how we define a clear goal is having a question that has a measurable outcome, one that is going to be clear and concise and supported by statistical planning. To make sure that whatever we find in research is not potentially a chance result, that it really did occur because of whatever factors we're studying. And then that you have the right resources. So I mentioned all the things that are important to have lined up that people are giving to the research idea. And so this all involves, of course, number one, patients. Does the center that's opening the research have enough patients that fit a certain criteria to ensure that we'll get the number of patients that we want to participate? And are those patients going to be willing to do it? Is the study designed in a way where the question matters to them and the things that we're asking of them are reasonable? The scientific team is important. Do you have all the expertise to really look at the question in the way it should be looked at and think about all the potential pitfalls that can happen and account for them? And then funding. I think funding is always super important because the studies that we do in breast cancer take a lot to look at things like novel ways to get imaging for patients or to look at blood biomarkers of response to treatments. Those things are all really expensive. And particularly for this group, you may know that the lobular recurrences often happen later on after the diagnosis, many times beyond 5 years. So you really have to have the investment to follow patients for a long time to get that kind of information. Of course, that's expensive. And so the other thing about a research idea is once the work is done, you need to be able to share the findings with the scientific community. And that's really what we're going to talk about today in terms of how that happens, and an example of that from our own work. And so the way that the research findings get disseminated or shared with the community, I think it's important that we present and share findings for all results in all studies. So you will find that in the literature, there's really a bias for publishing positive studies, meaning those that show the outcome that we're hoping for, the outcome that makes a difference. But there's a lot of value in, quote, negative studies also, where maybe the results didn't turn out how we thought, or using a new treatment doesn't really work. That's important too, because we don't want to spin our wheels and reinvestigate the same topic over and over, if we can avoid it. And so really being transparent and sharing both the studies that have done and what the results are is key for our community. And then the way that this is done, it usually starts with a submission of an abstract or creation of an abstract, which is oftentimes, a few 100-word document that gets at what is the key, the kernel of the question that was done or the work that was done, and what are the basic results. And those will be things that a couple of times a year, these abstracts are requested for our major conferences. And then if accepted, that goes on to become a poster presentation or an oral abstract presentation. And then following those presentations, these abstracts go on to become full papers or publications, where all the details about the study design, the results that were developed, and any sort of future directions or clinical implications will be commented on. So how do you get the most out of evaluating these conferences and going to them and looking through the presentations? I would say step number one is know the conferences that you're going to get the most out of. So if you're a breast cancer advocate and a lobular friend, the conferences that you might get the most out of are things like San Antonio Breast Cancer, which Lori highlighted, ASCO, which is the main national oncology meeting, that is held once a year and has a very, very large breast cancer section. There's ESMO, which is the European version of ASCO, the American conference. And then we have our own specific smaller conferences dedicated to certain topics like the ILC Symposium. I put AACR on here, which is a little bit more of a basic science sort of driven conference, maybe less direct clinical application. But I think that there are plenty of presentations there that form the basis of what we like to then bring to the clinical space. And so those conferences can be really helpful. It just has to be viewed with sort of a different lens of what you might get out of it and what you take home afterwards. And then once you've identified which conference you're going to go to, whether it's a national, regional, international conference, I would review the abstracts in advance and take advantage of the search functions for these online programs. Most of these programs are searchable by keywords, so you can actually type in ILC, lobular cancer, LCIS, anything that you find interesting, and you'll be able to create your own schedule or agenda out of those presentations. And then thankfully, for big conferences that cover multiple tumor types like ASCO, the organizers often create tracks for us where we can say, I'm interested in breast cancer, so here's all the things that I want to attend. And that way you don't have to look through the hundreds of pages of the full program. The other thing that I find really helpful in busy life and busy days are to watch for these preview emails that come from the conference themselves or other major media outlets. And I've listed a few of them here. And they will often say, here's a national expert in breast cancer, and here's what topics they're excited about, and here's when those presentations are, and here's why we think that's going to be influential in clinical practice the week following the conference. So these are things that I look out for, because sometimes I'm like, I in my own research, I didn't see that X, Y, or Z was being presented, but this does look important to my patients, and they will ask about it, so I want to attend. So you'll get a sense of who your trusted media outlets are, and they can be really, really helpful in crafting your approach to the conference. So if you're attending live, whether that's in person or virtual, a lot of our conferences since COVID have become these hybrid conferences where you can attend from home, which is a really nice option, but still get everything in real time. So I always make an agenda with the sessions that are sort of my can't miss opportunities that I know I want to see those in real time. And I usually prioritize the oral sessions because that's where a lot of the practice changing data will be. So the big presentations are usually at something they call the plenary session. And those will be your most practice changing, immediately impacting or talking with your doctors about it. And then the other oral sessions will be things that either are ready for clinical practice or getting close. In the poster session is where you're going to find a lot more sort of smaller topics, kind of looking at patient populations at different clinical institutions and what their experience has been. And this is actually where I find a lot of the lobular cancer information, because you'll find that big breast cancer oral presentations are very frequently those studies of hundreds, if not thousands of patients. And many of our lobular presentations are often smaller, just by the nature of how frequently it occurs and how many patients are at each individual location where treatment is given. So you'll often find things about, subsets from clinical studies look at lobular, or single institution experiences looking back at how their patients do with X, Y, or Z treatment. Those things will be in the poster sessions often. Now, there might be special topic sessions. This year at ASCO, there was actually a section on rare subtypes or rare histologies, and lobular made an appearance there. So, keep in mind that searching for the terms ILC or for lobular cancer really can be super important. And I always like to attend anything that is a clinical challenge or a clinical case discussion, because so many of us struggle with the best way to treat our lobular patients, and we have so many questions that it's pretty usual that cases involving lobular cancer are presented at these sessions where we share general patient cases and talk about the things that are tough day to day. There's a wonderful session at San Antonio that's like this, where it's basically like a mock tumor board where clinicians from all over the country and even internationally can bring their cases and talk with a panel of experts about how they would handle it. And so I love those. I learn a lot every year from them, and it brings up lots of new ideas for research questions in my mind. And then I think any organizations that you're involved in, particularly LBCA, see if they have any special sessions or topics or ways to approach this. I know that we've had sort of poster crawls at San Antonio before with representatives from LBCA, where we go to the lobular posters and talk to the investigators. And it's a great opportunity to ask your questions, make some networking, get people enthusiastic, find ways to connect those researchers with each other. So there's really a lot that can happen. Of course, that's more of an in-person thing, but virtually there may be these reviews as well that you can share in. And then if you're catching up after the conference, again, your virtual outlets, I think the power of our world is that you can get a lot of information condensed down so you can get through it quickly and get the highest yield points for you. These hybrid conferences do have the presentations on demand. So let's say you're not available on the Saturday or Sunday where it's being presented live. If you're registered for the conference, you can often watch it later that evening or a couple days later, as though you were in real time, including the question and answer sessions, which are really important. And then your advocacy associations and local academic medical centers will often put on reviews from the various conferences. So we did ours, I believe, just last week at Cleveland Clinic from ASCO, and that had topics on all sorts of different cancers. But you can also look and see when the breast cancer topic is. And many times for advocates and patients, those types of sessions are often free. So keep an eye out for that. I think wherever you are in the country, find your big medical centers and see what they do in terms of conference or symposia review. And then the other thing that's just practical is ask your doctors and their medical team what they're excited about. I think we love the opportunity to talk about this stuff. We love the idea of patients being engaged in their care and wondering what the next steps are. And it often gives a good outlet to say, hey, if we had a trial like this, or if we ask this kind of question, I'd like to participate. So it can be a two-way street where you learn more and your doctor learns more about what interests you and maybe what kinds of ideas would be good for that institution to start researching. So when we're looking at posters directly, I wanted to bring up a couple examples. So this is a traditional poster, and it's specifically not about breast cancer because I didn't want you to read the breast cancer information. I don't know if anyone's really interested in video game addiction, but you can read that too. But video addiction in cats, that would be cool. But what you see here is that this poster has a ton of text on it. And it follows this traditional format called the IMRAD format, where you have a little bit of introduction, then a more extensive method section, a very large results section, and then a smaller section, then followed by references. And I think what's hard about posters like this at national meetings is that the poster sessions are usually 2 to 3 hours. So let's say there are 20 posters you want to look at conservatively. It's hard to get through all this text and talk to people at a poster in a way that you're actually going to remember and be able to take something away from. And so this is kind of has developed to be the traditional poster format because it's kind of easy to take what you submit as your abstract and put it here in the poster. But I think it's actually really hard for consumption of the data. And so in my mind, if you see posters like this, what I would really take away is focus on the graphics, see what you can get out from the results that are meaningful to you. Look through the conclusion. I think a lot of conclusion areas on posters will actually have more bullet points that are a little bit easier to read. But, you know, or even take advantage of the presenter who's standing there by the poster. Many times if you say, hey, you know, I'm interested in your poster based on the title, can you give me a 2-minute walkthrough? Then they'll be able to do that for you and it'll save you reading all of this text, but you'll still get all the highlights. So in general, what a poster is going to give you is a little bit more detail generally than what's in the abstract, but not as much as would be in the full publication. But when you see posters like this, I think really take advantage of the presenter who's there to get more out of it. And then a more modern approach to the anatomy of a poster, and this we're seeing slow change over to this format, is where you have a lot more pictorial representation and graphics, and a big emphasis right here in the middle of what the conclusion is. So if you take nothing else away here, you would probably get a sense of the title, the conclusion, and maybe one of these diagrams will stick in your mind. Because the rest of it, the methods section, you can go back and look that up, right? And you can view this poster at a later time and come back to some of the results. But this is a lot easier to take a of or write down a major bullet point and then come back to an investigator or say for the person presenting it who's there, hey, can you walk me through this particular diagram? It really draws my interest. So I think that over time, we're going to start seeing more posters that look like this. And the presenter of this particular poster tweeted out after I was able to find it that he did this poster representation based on a presentation by this guy, Mike Morrison, for how to make a better poster, and that it was really, really well received. And I'm seeing this at more and more oncology conferences, and I really hope it picks up steam. And if you ever find yourself putting together a poster and want that better poster format, this is actually the YouTube video for that, how to create a better poster. And it actually has some pretty interesting ideas. It's about a 19-minute video, and it goes through how to navigate a national meeting, how to make your experience presenting a poster better, how to make your experience as the attendee of a poster session better, and then how to poster. So I found it's actually done in a really sort of comical way that keeps your interest very easily. So when I'm navigating a poster session, I always like to have a plan, as we talked about. Have your agenda, know where you want to go, know what are your must-hit highlights. I always like to have a buddy with me, so that way if we have to divide and conquer, then we can come back and regroup together as we debrief from the conference. And then one really cool thing that has happened over time with poster sessions is a lot of presenters will have QR codes on their poster. So even if you don't go back and look through posters on the conference's website after the conference, which admittedly can be a little bit daunting because the posters are really dense and they're really small, and so they're hard to navigate. The QR codes will take you to a much better version of that, and then you'll have everything saved the way you want it. And during the actual oral presentations as well as posters, I take a ton of photos of the slides. It's a way for me to go back and look or show people things in my patients, things in my clinic, or colleagues, things that we're interested about, just as a quick reference. And you can always use that. The presenter's information is on those slides, and so usually with their emails. So if you wanted to regroup with them afterwards, you can. And it's nice to have a little notepad to jot ideas down. A lot of the conferences, if you attend in person, as you get your physical program, they will have a little notepad and a pen to give you. But if you're at home, having something next to you to jot ideas down is a really good thing. And then I think collecting those emails is helpful for future correspondence, networking, participating in trials. I mean, this is how our world works now, even in medicine. So I think that this is a great opportunity just to have more connection with the people doing the research and the topic you're interested in. So moving into some actual data, this is my presentation from San Antonio 2021 about pleomorphic invasive lobular carcinoma versus non-pleomorphic lobular carcinoma. And here's our poster, which has more white space, so I'm happy about that. I think I'm trying to get to, just what you preach. It's not as great as the other one I showed you, but we're getting there. So just so you have the full picture here in front of you. But we'll go through each section one by one. So this idea came to us because one of the big issues that we tackle in clinic is how do we individualize patient care? How do we find those groups of patients, whether it's IDC patients versus ILC patients, hormone receptor positive versus hormone receptor negative, premenopausal versus postmenopausal, these are a lot of common themes you'll hear. But what about within ILC? And that's really hard to do because you're taking a small piece of the pie and making it even smaller. But I think there are very clinically relevant differences within ILC that we should be mindful of. And pleomorphic came to mind because this is a type of ILC histologically. So the way it looks under the microscope is very different compared to our classic ILC. And those differences in the way they look under the microscope have an underpinning of different biologic behavior, at least we think. And when you look at overall clinical outcomes, there have been reports where pleomorphic ILC has worse overall cancer-related outcomes and survival and recurrence risk compared to classic ILC. So the natural question for us is that really true? Do these two types have different biologic behaviors? If so, what might account for that? And if there is a difference, how can we approach treatment differently, knowing that the outcomes are different? Can we do anything to improve the outcomes for this group that is worse within a more general context? And I think the other thing that, as we researched this, that got our attention was that among many things in ILC, that there are really differing reports. Some reports would say pleomorphic ILC does worse, some say pleomorphic ILC does the same. So we wanted to sort of add to that body of literature. And the way that we attempted this is we've started this sort of lobular cancer database at Cleveland Clinic. It's a retrospective, meaning we're looking at all of our patients who had previously been treated. And we're working on getting this up and running prospectively, where we capture all patients coming through our system and follow them as things happen, as they get treatment, as they either do or do not have recurrences, or as new things come out that we knew, maybe treatment techniques or imaging techniques. How do we apply those to our existing patients? But anyway, our presentation in San Antonio were all founded in this existing database who were treated at Cleveland Clinic from 2004 to 2017. And we had 691 total patients with invasive lobular carcinoma that was not metastatic. So these are our stage 1 through 3 breast cancer patients. And we recorded all the information we could think to record on. So this would be the patient characteristics, like their age, their other medical problems, the timing of their diagnosis. We recorded their cancer size, lymph node involvement, the ER/PR HER2 results, and any treatment characteristics. And then we documented any recurrences or deaths that occurred. And we compared the group that had pleomorphic histology versus those that had non-pleomorphic histology. So that captures classical ILC as well as a variety of other subtypes up in this bullet point here. First bullet point here, so solid, mixed, tubulo-lobular. Our database doesn't really get into the degree where we could separate out those other subtypes more. Basically, we were just able to say pleomorphic or not. And so the pleomorphic group was actually pretty big. It represented 100 out of these 691 patients, which is bigger than other series that I've seen out there. And when you compare the different characteristics that we found between the non-pleomorphic group and the pleomorphic group, I think there's certain key differences that I want to mention. Usually when you look at, say, treatment trials and you're comparing different groups, those groups should be pretty much identical. When you go into a treatment trial and patients are randomized to one treatment or another, they get their treatment assigned randomly in a computer, the whole goal is to create groups that are very similar. So you can say, oh, this treatment is or is not working in a similar group. Here, we actually did want to separate out two groups that we thought would be intentionally different to see what the impact of different treatments would be. Now, those treatments were not randomly assigned. They were whatever the patient's clinician had decided that was most appropriate for them over time. There's some bias there because we don't know how that decision-making was made. But when you look at these groups, I see that they are pretty different. The median age is pretty similar. Most of the patients were postmenopausal, as you would expect, although the pleomorphic ILC patients maybe had a smidge more premenopausal patients. The ER and PR was very strongly positive for both groups, as you would expect. But then we start to get into factors that were pretty different. So the amount of HER2 positivity among the groups was different, 12% in pleomorphic ILC versus 7% in non-pleomorphic. And this is really crucial because those patients that are HER2 positive will have much different treatment options. And they also have different expected outcomes compared to those patients who are HER2 negative. There was more grade 3 tumors among the pleomorphic ILC, which is also a previously reported finding. And more of the pleomorphic ILC patients had stage 2 or stage 3 tumors. So again, getting at that more aggressive biology, more advanced disease at presentation, higher grade disease. One finding that we actually did not expect was that there was more lymph node positivity among the non-pleomorphics compared to the pleomorphics. And I have a few guesses as to why this may be the case, but I don't know for sure. One of my thoughts is maybe that the pleomorphic ILC, because it does seem to be more aggressive and has larger tumor size in the breast, is maybe it's caught a little bit sooner on conventional imaging or by symptoms than before the lymph nodes are involved. Whereas, classic ILC, I think we've all heard stories of patients who have pretty small tumors of the breast, or what they thought were pretty small tumors of the breast, and all of a sudden they go to surgery and there's 10, 12, 14 lymph nodes involved. So that may be a function of how these tumors are detected, and that's definitely something I'd like to look at in the future. Mastectomy rate was pretty similar between the two, more though in the pleomorphic ILC, and that probably reflects those larger tumors in the breast. And then for sure there was a difference in the amount of chemotherapy given and HER2 targeted therapy given, both of those treatment options being utilized more often in pleomorphic ILC, largely because of those HER2 amplified patients. So you see that pretty much all the patients that were HER2 amplified got HER2 targeted therapy. So the chemotherapy difference is not entirely related to that. Otherwise you would expect, that it was about a 12% difference between the arms. I also suspect that this is driven by that grade 3 aspect of it, because those are patients that we are more likely to get testing like Oncotype or Mammaprintin, or just inherently in our guts be worried about, because grade 3 usually means faster growing and more biologically aggressive disease. Now, the most unexpected finding is actually in terms of recurrence-free survival, or RFS, and overall survival, or OS. So these are the actual tables from the poster. So I just wanted to walk you through them in the way that we would look at them as we're walking through the poster session. So here you can see about an 8% difference in the recurrence-free survival, meaning more patients with pleomorphic ILC are alive and free of cancer at the 10-year mark compared to those with non-pleomorphic ILC, and we actually would have expected the opposite. And then we see quite a difference in 10% difference in the overall survival, again, favoring the pleomorphic ILC. And those big kind of complicated in parentheses underneath those main numbers are 95% confidence intervals. So these are the statistical support showing that these hopefully numbers are not related to chance. When you're looking at confidence intervals, the tighter those two numbers are, so where you see for the 71.5 under non-pleomorphic ILC for 10-year recurrence-free survival, you see that 95% confidence interval is 58.7 to 84.2. That's pretty big. It kind of reflects that this isn't a huge study, that there's variability among the patients. Ideally, you want a confidence interval that's tighter, somewhere between 58 and maybe 70. And that would give you a better sense that all the data is clustering around one spot, and you can feel statistically more reassured that this is related to real differences and not just chance findings. And then these are a couple of curves. And so I wanted to highlight how you look at survival curves and how you look at hazard ratios. So to orient you, on the left-hand side of the screen, this is again recurrence-free survival, as you see here on the y-axis. On the x-axis, it's measured in years. So this is years since diagnosis. The red lines are for pleomorphic ILC, and the blue line is for non-pleomorphic ILC. And generally, when you're looking at survival curves, if you're close to 1 here, you think of this as 100. If this line went straight out, it would mean that every patient included in here lived over the whole 15-year period. That would be 100% survival. But what we see is that the curves decline with time, which means some recurrence events are happening. So these people are having cancer show back up again as metastatic disease or cancer recurrences in the breast or lymph nodes. And the big thing that you're looking for here is, do the curves separate, and when do they separate? So here we see around that 6-ish year mark, we start to see more separation that goes out beyond 7.5 years, out to 10 years. And then it's always hard to know what to make at the end of the curve because there's so few patients represented here. Not as many patients make it out this far, usually on studies. We have most of our events or recurrence events clustering here around the middle, or what we call the median. So when you see things reported as median recurrence-free survival, you're taking the 50% mark here and bringing it down and seeing when those events occur. So what I would say here is that the curves separate in favor of the pleomorphic ILC patients doing better. But there's a caveat, which is when you look at the statistics, under the hazard ratio, this is the likelihood that patients are really doing better compared to their comparator arm. So when you see 1.52, this is about a 48% improvement of the pleomorphic ILC compared to the non-Pleo ILC. But you always want to look again at that confidence interval. And here, if these cross 1, so that's the key number to keep in mind, is 1. That means that this is not a statistically significant difference. And it's one of those things that always comes up is, what is clinically meaningful versus statistically significant? Are those two things the same? And sometimes they're not. Sometimes even though the statistics don't support it, we still say, wow, an 8% or 10% difference, that would be meaningful to my patient. And this is where clinicians and statisticians may go back and forth. But that's generally what you're looking at these curves. You're looking which curve is towards the top. That's the group that does better, has less recurrences, better survival. And when you're looking at hazard ratios, basically take this as, if the hazard ratio is 1, it means both groups do exactly the same. If the hazard ratio is over 1, it means one group is doing better than the other. And that's what you're seeing here. But keep in mind, when things cross 1 in the 95% confidence interval, that's when you have to be a little bit skeptical that this could be related to chance. And in most studies, it's just because the numbers are not big enough to be able to show a difference. So I'm still really intrigued and interested by this finding, but what this means is we need to do more work, get more patients, and see if this trend holds true in that bigger sample size. And so what I've summarized here is basically the things that I to you along the way, is that we're worried about pleomorphic ILC because we're concerned that those patients have more aggressive disease and could do worse. But what we found is that these patients actually have better outcomes in the setting of less node positivity and higher HER2 positivity. And I think those factors probably make a big difference. So our immediate next step was to look at how the pleomorphic ILC patients do, depending on if they were HER2 positive or HER2 negative. Because one might expect, if this was all being driven by the fact that the HER2 positive patients have different outcomes and get different treatment, then when we take them out of the equation, the pleomorphic HER2 negative patients may look a lot more like the non-pleomorphic patients, or they may actually be worse than the HER2 positive pleomorphic patients. So that's kind of where our next step would be. And you would expect that that kind of follow-up data or more granular detailed data would come in the manuscript publication of this data as a paper. It leads to a bigger question about, are there treatment responsiveness difference or different outcomes for patients with pleomorphic ILC? So maybe some clarity on the topic, but honestly more questions, which is usually what happens with research.